The morning came slowly to the little station, as if even the sun was unsure whether it wished to witness what had been left behind. Dust moved across the platform in thin golden sheets. The tracks shimmered like twin ribbons, stretching into a horizon that did not promise anything anymore. A wooden bench stood beneath a crooked sign that read Briar's Hollow, and upon that bench sat a bride who no longer belonged to a wedding. Her name was Eliza May Carter. 3 days earlier, the train had arrived in a roar of steam and iron. It had hissed and breathed and waited. Passengers had boarded. Conductors had shouted. Trunks had been loaded. And all the while, Eliza had stood there in her white dress, gloved hands folded over a bouquet of prairie roses, searching every face for the man who was meant to be her future. Thomas Hale never came. The train did not wait for heartbreak. It never does. It pulled away with a long, aching whistle that seemed to mock her stillness. White fabric trembled in the wind as she stood alone on the platform, watching the last car disappear into the heat-hazed distance. Now, it was the fourth sunrise since that sound. Her dress, once bright as new milk, carried the faint stain of desert dust. The lace at her sleeves had begun to curl at the edges. A small tear near the hem whispered of gravel and stumbling. Her veil lay folded beside her suitcase, no longer perched upon her hair. She had removed it the second day, when the whispers grew too loud. People had not known where to look. Some had pitted her with soft eyes and tight mouths. Others had stared openly, as if humiliation were a spectacle laid out for public viewing. A wedding without a groom leaves behind more than a woman. It leaves behind gossip that travels faster than trains. On the afternoon of the wedding, a stable boy had delivered a folded note. His hands had shaken as he passed it to her. He did not meet her gaze. The envelope bore Thomas's hurried script. He had written that he was sorry, that circumstances had changed, that he had found opportunity elsewhere, that she would understand in time. He had left town that morning with the daughter of a cattle baron from the north, a woman whose father owned half the grazing land between here and the river, a woman whose future glimmered with gold. Eliza had read the letter once, then twice. The words had not changed their meaning. They had not softened. She had folded it carefully and placed it in her reticule, as if it were a receipt for something purchased and regretted. Thomas had always loved admiration. He loved the way townsfolk clapped him on the back, loved how his boots echoed in saloons, loved the way Eliza looked at him like he hung the moon over the prairie. But admiration is not devotion, and a man who feeds on praise will often trade loyalty for applause. Eliza's mother had warned her gently, years before her passing. Love is not loud, her mother had once said while brushing Eliza's hair by lamplight. It is steady. Thomas had been loud. Now the station was quiet. Old Mr. Calloway, the station master, moved about with the deliberate patience of a man who had seen more departures than arrivals. He had offered her coffee the first morning, black and strong in a chipped tin cup. He had not asked questions. That kindness felt heavier than curiosity would have. On the second day, Mrs. Henley, a widow who lived near the mill, brought her a wool shawl. Even in summer, desert evenings could turn cold without warning. Mrs. Henley draped it over Eliza's shoulders and squeezed her hand without speaking. Silence can be the most merciful language. Not everyone chose mercy. 2 young girls passed that afternoon, their braids swinging like pendulums of judgment. They whispered just loud enough to be heard. Imagine waiting like that. Maybe she did something to deserve it. Men do not leave for nothing. Eliza did not look up. Shame burns brightest when fed by defense. She let the words fall around her like dry leaves. The truth was simpler than rumor. Her childhood home had been sold after her mother's passing. The wedding had been her bridge into a new life. When Thomas vanished, so too did the doorway she had planned to step through. She was not waiting for another train. She did not know where else to go. On the first evening, she removed her gloves. They lay folded neatly on the bench beside her. On the second, she untied the veil and placed it in her suitcase. The gesture felt ceremonial, like lowering a flag at sunset. By the third day, the bouquet had wilted entirely. Prairie roses do not thrive once severed from their roots. She rose at dawn and walked the length of the platform, her boots leaving faint impressions in the dust. The station felt smaller now. The world felt larger. A freight train thundered past without stopping. The force of its passing tugged at her skirt and loosened strands of her hair. She did not flinch. She watched the cars blur together and thought of all the places she might have gone had she boarded. But longing for a different yesterday is like chasing smoke. It curls away the moment you reach for it. By the third evening, the sky burned orange and violet, colors so beautiful they felt almost cruel. The desert has a way of displaying splendor in the midst of sorrow, as if reminding you that grief is never the only thing alive. Eliza sat again on the bench. For 3 days she had held herself upright. She had swallowed tears as if they were bitter medicine. She had answered no questions because none had been asked directly. But the sunset undid her. A single tear slid down her cheek. Then another. They fell not for Thomas. Not for the wedding that would never be. They fell for the girl she had been at 16, braiding her hair and dreaming of a home filled with laughter. They fell for the trust she had offered so freely. They fell for the belief that love meant being chosen and kept. The platform was nearly empty now. Even Mr. Calloway had retreated inside, giving her privacy that felt like respect. She pressed her palms against her eyes and let the sob come at last. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was the quiet breaking of something that had tried very hard to remain whole. And then, as if summoned by destiny itself, a small shadow crossed the dust before her shoes. Eliza lowered her hands. Before her stood a little girl with sun-browned cheeks and braids that refused neatness. Her dress bore patches at the elbows. Her boots were too large, as if borrowed from a future she intended to grow into quickly. The child looked up without fear. Her eyes were wide, not with mockery, not with pity, but with something startlingly earnest. She tilted her head slightly, studying the woman in white as if measuring the shape of her sadness. And in a voice clear as creek water over stone, she asked, "Will you marry my daddy?" The words did not carry mischief. They carried hope. The wind stilled, just for a breath. Eliza blinked, uncertain whether grief had conjured an illusion. The little girl stepped closer, hands clasped behind her back, as though presenting a serious proposal. "My daddy looks lonely," she continued softly. "And you look lonely too." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the tracks that had once promised escape. For the first time in 3 days, something inside Eliza shifted. Not mended, not healed, but stirred. And sometimes in stories the prairie keeps close to its chest, that is how redemption begins. Not with a grand gesture, not with a train returning, but with the brave question of a child who sees two broken hearts and imagines they might fit together. The little girl did not blink after asking. Children who grow up around loss learn to speak plainly. They do not waste words circling what adults fear to name. "Will you marry my daddy?" The question hung between them like a fragile lantern. Eliza brushed the dampness from her cheeks and studied the child more closely. Freckles scattered across her nose, one braid looser than the other, a small scab on her knee, proof of recent adventure. And yet there was something older in her eyes. Not sadness exactly, something steadier, as if she had already learned that life did not always return what it took. "What is your name, sweetheart?" Eliza asked gently. "Clarabelle," the girl replied, chin lifting a little with pride. "I am 7, and my daddy is not mean." It was an oddly specific defense. Before Eliza could respond, boots sounded against the platform boards. Slow, measured, hesitant. A man approached from the far end of the station, hat in hand. He did not rush. He did not scold. His name was Daniel Brooks. He had shoulders shaped by years at the forge, broad and patient. His hands were marked with small scars, the quiet signatures of labor. Dark hair streaked lightly at the temples, eyes that seemed to carry weather in them, not storms but seasons. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Clara," he said softly. The child turned, but did not retreat. "I was helping," she insisted. Daniel gave the faintest exhale, almost a smile, but not quite. Then he looked at Eliza, and in that look, there was no amusement, no curiosity sharpened into gossip, no pity disguised as kindness. There was only recognition. "Ma'am," he said, voice low and steady, "I apologize if my daughter has troubled you." "She has not," Eliza answered. "Not all." Silence settled again, but it was different from the silences of the past 3 days. This one did not press against her chest. Clara rocked on her heels. "Daddy," she said plainly, "you said we needed someone kind." Daniel's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in the quiet discomfort of truth spoken aloud. "We did not discuss proposals, Clarabelle." The child crossed her arms in miniature defiance. "Well, I did." Eliza felt the corner of her mouth lift before she could stop it. The first hint of a smile since the train whistle. Daniel noticed. It was a small thing, that smile. But he noticed. "If you'll excuse us, ma'am," he said gently. "Clara, come along." The girl hesitated, then leaned toward Eliza conspiratorially. "You think about it," she whispered. Then she skipped off beside her father, dust puffing at her boots. Eliza watched them go. He walked beside his daughter, not ahead of her. Their shadows stretched long across the platform, parallel but close. Something about that image stayed with her long after they disappeared beyond the bend of the road. The next morning, Clara returned. This time she carried a single wildflower, slightly crushed but offered with solemn ceremony. "For you," she said, placing it on the bench. Eliza accepted it as though it were something rare. They sat together in companionable quiet. Clara swung her legs and asked practical questions. "Do you know how to read big words? Can you sew? Are you scared of chickens?" Eliza answered each with thoughtful seriousness. By afternoon, Daniel appeared at the edge of the station grounds. He did not intrude. He leaned against a post, arms folded loosely, observing from a distance that felt protective rather than suspicious. He was a blacksmith. His forge stood near the western edge of town. He had lost his wife 3 winters ago to a fever that came swift and unrelenting. Since then, he had lived quietly, worked steadily, spoke little. He had not sought another woman, not because he lacked opportunity, but because grief rearranges a man's interior in ways the eye cannot see. Clara began coming daily, sometimes with bread wrapped in cloth, sometimes with small stones she claimed were shaped like hearts, sometimes with nothing but questions. Daniel accompanied her when work allowed. On the 4th day after their first meeting, he approached the bench where Eliza sat mending a tear in her skirt. He did not mention her wedding dress. It had been replaced now with a simple pale blue frock borrowed from Mrs. Henley. He did not ask about Thomas. Instead, he held out her suitcase. "The clasp was broken," he said. "I fixed it." Eliza ran her fingers over the smooth metal. The repair was careful, nearly invisible. "Thank you," she murmured. He nodded once. "If you require employment, the station master mentioned you have a steady hand with sewing. The schoolhouse could use help repairing uniforms before autumn." It was not charity. It was opportunity. She felt something loosen inside her chest. "I will be grateful," she said. He tipped his hat slightly, then stepped back, giving her room to decide her own future. The town, of course, noticed. Towns always do. Some raised eyebrows at the sight of Eliza speaking with Daniel. Others softened toward her, seeing her not as a discarded bride, but as a woman beginning again. And then, like an unwanted echo, Thomas Hale returned. Not for her, for business. He rode into town on a glossy bay horse, boots polished, smile practiced. He saw her before she saw him. Eliza stood near the station steps, Clara beside her, pointing excitedly at a freight car being unloaded. Thomas slowed. For a flicker of a second, uncertainty crossed his face. She was not weeping, not wilted, not waiting. She was laughing softly at something Clara had said. He approached with that familiar charm, polished bright. "Eliza." Her name in his mouth felt foreign now. She turned. There was a time when that face would have stirred hope. Now it stirred memory, and memory no longer held power. Thomas removed his hat. "I suppose you heard there were complications." "I received your note," she replied calmly. He glanced toward Clara, then back at her. "I did what I believed best." "For whom?" she asked gently. He did not answer. Daniel stood a short distance away, unloading supplies from a wagon. He did not stride over, did not claim space that was not his. He simply remained present. Thomas shifted, unsettled by that quiet presence. "You cannot stay here forever, Eliza," he said. "I do not intend to." She met his gaze without trembling. Something passed between them then. Not reconciliation, not regret, release. Thomas nodded stiffly and stepped back. The town watched. Eliza did not chase him with anger. She did not wound him with sharp words. She simply turned back to Clara, who tugged her sleeve impatiently. "You were telling me about that big word," Clara insisted. "Determination," Eliza said softly. "What does it mean?" "It means you keep going, even when things do not go the way you hoped." Clara considered this, then nodded gravely. "Like you." Eliza swallowed. "Perhaps." Across the platform, Daniel lifted a crate and set it down with steady strength. That evening, as the sky dimmed and a cool wind moved through town, Daniel approached her once more. "Winter will come sooner than we expect," he said. She knew what he meant. "You are welcome to stay at my home until you find your footing. There's a spare room. Clara has already decided you make the best bread." He did not look at her as a rescuer, nor as a suitor, only as a man offering shelter without demand. "You would not owe me anything," he added quietly. Eliza looked down the tracks one last time. They no longer felt like accusation. They felt like a path she did not need to take. She lifted her gaze to Daniel, not in surrender, but in consideration. The sun dipped low behind him, outlining his form in amber light. And for the first time since the train had left without her, the future did not feel like an empty platform. It felt like a door standing open, waiting for her to decide whether she wished to step through. The house stood at the edge of town, where the prairie began to stretch its long golden back toward the horizon. It was not grand. 2 rooms below, 2 above. A porch that leaned slightly to the left, as if listening to the wind. The forge sat behind it, dark by evening, glowing by dawn. Smoke from its chimney rose like a steady breath into the sky. Eliza arrived with 1 suitcase and a heart that still startled easily. Clara met her at the gate with the seriousness of a host greeting honored company. "You can have the room with the window," she announced. "It sees the sunrise first." Daniel carried the suitcase inside without ceremony. He placed it by the narrow bed beneath a quilt stitched from faded scraps of fabric. Nothing in the room was extravagant. Everything in it was cared for. That first night, Eliza lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house. Floorboards settling. The faint clink of metal cooling in the forge. Clara's soft breathing down the hall. It did not feel like trespassing. It felt like being trusted. Days unfolded quietly. Eliza rose early and found herself drawn to the kitchen before anyone else stirred. She kneaded dough with deliberate patience, the rhythm soothing as prayer. Clara would wander in, hair tangled, eyes still heavy with dreams. "Teach me that big word again," she would mumble. "Resilience," Eliza would reply, smiling. Daniel watched these small rituals without intrusion. He drank his coffee in thoughtful silence, sometimes offering a nod of appreciation when the bread turned out especially golden. He did not crowd her. He did not hover. He gave her space to belong. Eliza began helping at the forge when orders grew heavy. She organized tools, recorded deliveries, mended worn gloves. Her hands, once meant only for embroidery and church socials, grew stronger. One afternoon, she burned her fingers on a still warm horseshoe. Daniel reached her quickly, not panicked, not sharp. "Cool water," he said gently. His hands enveloped hers beneath the pump. Broad palms steady. No embarrassment. No unnecessary touch. "You do not have to prove yourself here," he murmured. She met his eyes. "I'm not proving," she said softly. "I am learning." Something shifted then. Not romance. Respect. The town adjusted slowly to her new place in it. Some still whispered. Most grew accustomed. Eliza began helping the schoolteacher twice a week. Clara beamed with pride each time she introduced her. "This is Miss Eliza. She knows words that feel like blankets." The seasons turned. Autumn brushed the prairie in amber. Then winter came, sudden and unrelenting. Snow in Briar's Hollow fell like silence. Heavy, soft, transforming everything it touched. One bitter night, Clara woke with fever. Her small body burned hot against cold sheets. Breath shallow, eyes glassy. Daniel stood beside the bed, fear flickering beneath his composure. He had seen illness steal once before. The memory lingered like frostbite. Eliza did not hesitate. She moved through the night with quiet authority. Cool cloths, measured sips of broth. A lullaby hummed low and steady. Daniel watched her sit at Clara's bedside long after midnight. Watched her smooth, damp curls from the child's forehead. Watched her whisper reassurance, as though she had always known how. "You should rest," he said near dawn. "So should you," she replied. Neither moved. When morning finally came pale and fragile through the window, Clara's fever had broken. Relief did not arrive loudly. It settled like sunlight. Daniel stepped outside onto the porch. Snow crunched beneath his boots. He removed his hat and breathed deep. He had guarded his heart carefully since his wife's passing. Not out of coldness, out of preservation, but something inside him had begun to thaw. Not because Eliza had saved his daughter, because she had loved her without hesitation. When he returned inside, he found Eliza asleep in the chair beside Clara's bed, head tilted awkwardly, exhaustion softening her features. He draped a blanket over her shoulders, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future that did not feel like betrayal of the past. Winter eased its grip. Snow receded into muddy earth. Green shoots began to press upward through thawing ground. Love, if it could be called that yet, did not arrive in thunder. It grew like wheat, slow, rooted, reaching. One evening, after Clara had fallen asleep, Daniel and Eliza sat at the kitchen table with only a lantern between them. The quiet felt full. He spoke first. "My wife," he began carefully, "loved music. She sang while she cooked. The house felt larger when she sang." Eliza listened, not threatened, not compared. "She sounds beautiful," Eliza said. "She was," he replied, "and she was stubborn." A small smile touched his mouth. "Loss does not erase love," he continued. "It only changes its shape." Eliza folded her hands on the table. "I feared loving again would make me foolish," she admitted. He shook his head slowly. "It makes you brave." Their fingers brushed across the wood. Neither pulled away. They did not rush to define what lived between them. They let it breathe. Spring arrived like forgiveness. Wildflowers scattered color across the prairie. Clara declared that turning 8 required celebration of the grandest sort. They spread a blanket near the edge of the field where the grass rolled like gentle waves. Clara wore a crown of daisies she had woven herself. Daniel carried a basket heavy with bread and preserves. Eliza brought lemonade sweetened carefully. They laughed more easily now, the kind of laughter that feels earned. After cake crumbs dotted the blanket and Clara had made 3 solemn wishes, she stood between them with hands on her hips. "Well," she said matter-of-factly, "now will you marry my daddy?" Daniel inhaled slowly. He did not scold her. He did not laugh it off. Instead, he looked at Eliza. Really looked. "Clara," he said softly, "go gather more flowers for your crown." The girl scampered off, satisfied that momentum had been created. Daniel turned fully toward Eliza. "I did not invite you here to fill a space left empty," he began. "I invited you because you bring warmth to this house." His voice did not tremble. "I do not need rescuing, and I will not rescue you. But if you choose it, I would be honored to walk beside you. Not ahead, not behind." The prairie wind moved gently through her hair. Eliza's heart beat steady but fast. She thought of the station, the train, the humiliation that had once defined her. She thought of winter nights and fevered brows, of shared bread, of quiet respect. "I am afraid sometimes," she confessed. "So am I," he said. She smiled. "That seems fair." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a simple ring. Not ornate, not extravagant, just solid. "Will you marry me, Eliza May Carter?" She hesitated, not from doubt, from understanding the weight of yes. Love is not a train you chase. It is a field you tend. Finally, she nodded. Yes. The word felt less like surrender and more like home. Daniel exhaled slowly, relief soft and profound. From across the field, Clara's triumphant voice rang out. I knew it. They laughed, the sound carried by wind across blooming grass. But as joy settled around them, Eliza sensed something else stirring in town. Not all stories close quietly. Some require one last test of courage. And though her heart had chosen, the past had not yet fully loosened its grip. Spring may soften the earth, but it also reveals what winter tried to bury. Spring in Briar's Hollow carried the scent of turned soil and second chances. Word traveled quickly. By the time the blacksmith's engagement to the rejected bride became common knowledge, it had already gathered opinions of its own. Some called it sweet, some called it foolish, a few called it scandalous. Thomas Hale called it impossible. He arrived in town on a bright afternoon, riding confidence like a polished saddle. His coat was newer than before, his boots unscuffed, but charm, when stretched thin, begins to fray at the edges. He heard the news at the saloon. Daniel Brooks, the blacksmith, and her. Thomas laughed at first, a short, brittle sound. Then he stepped back into the sunlight with something sharp coiling beneath his ribs. Eliza stood in the town square later that day, arms filled with folded uniforms for the schoolchildren. Clara skipped ahead of her, humming an invented tune. The world felt ordinary, which is to say it felt precious. Thomas approached without announcement. You move quickly, he said. His voice still carried that practiced ease, but there was strain beneath it now, like wood beginning to crack. Eliza did not flinch. Good afternoon, Thomas. He glanced at Clara, then back at her. Is this true? You plan to marry him? She adjusted the stack in her arms. Yes. He stepped closer. You were to be my wife. The word was possessive. Heavy. I was to be, she answered calmly. But you chose otherwise. I made a practical decision, he insisted. A better opportunity. She studied him then, not with anger, not even with resentment, with clarity. And, am I an opportunity, Thomas? He hesitated. You belonged with me. No, she said softly. I waited for you. The distinction settled between them like a line drawn in sand. A small crowd had begun to gather at the edges of the square. Townsfolk sensing that something long unfinished was reaching its final chapter. You embarrass yourself, he muttered. Marrying a blacksmith after wearing my ring. Eliza felt the old humiliation try to rise, but did not take hold. She lifted her chin. I wore your ring when I believed you would stand beside me. You left before I reached the altar. There is no shame in surviving abandonment. The words were not sharp. They were steady. Thomas's jaw tightened. From across the square, Daniel approached. Not in haste, not in anger. He walked until he stood beside Eliza. Not in front of her, not shielding her. Beside her. Thomas looked between them. You think you have won something, he scoffed. Daniel's voice was even. Love is not something won. It is something given. Thomas's eyes flickered with frustration. She was mine. Daniel shook his head once. No man owns a woman's future. Silence spread through the square. Not dramatic, not loud, simply undeniable. Eliza felt warmth at her side. Not protection, partnership. Thomas's confidence faltered beneath the weight of witnesses. He replaced his hat with stiff dignity. You will regret this, he said quietly. Perhaps, Eliza replied, but it will be my regret. That was the final thread. Thomas mounted his horse and rode out of town without looking back. The dust he left behind did not linger long. The wedding was held where her first ending had begun, at the station, not because she wished to reclaim humiliation, but because she wished to transform it. The platform had been swept clean. Wildflowers lined the railing. Mr. Calloway wore his best coat and pretended his eyes were not misted. Eliza's dress was simple ivory, altered by her own hands. No veil this time. Her hair pinned back with a comb Clara had insisted was lucky. Clara stood at her side, gripping her hand with solemn importance. You are not allowed to disappear, Clara whispered. I am staying, Eliza promised. The train schedule had been adjusted, so no roaring engine would interrupt the ceremony. But as fate would have it, a distant whistle sounded just as Daniel took his place before her. The sound drifted over the prairie like memory. Eliza did not turn toward it. She kept her eyes on him. Daniel's suit was plain, but carefully pressed. His hands, though scarred, trembled only slightly. Mr. Calloway cleared his throat and began. There were no grand speeches, no lavish decorations, just a small gathering of townsfolk who had witnessed her lowest day and now bore witness to her rising. Daniel spoke first. I cannot promise that life will not wound us again, but I promise that when it does, I will remain. I will stand beside you in sorrow and in harvest. I will choose you each morning without hesitation. Eliza felt tears gather, but they were not the tears of 3 days abandoned. They were the tears of being seen. I once believed love meant being chosen above all others, she said softly. Now I understand it means being chosen every day, even when seasons change. I do not marry you to replace what I lost. I marry you because with you, I have found something steady. The ring he placed on her finger was warm from his palm. When Mr. Calloway declared them husband and wife, Clara clapped louder than anyone. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a train passed without taking anything from her. Years softened the sharp edges of old pain. The station became less a symbol of loss and more a landmark of resilience. Eliza began teaching reading lessons in the evenings for girls whose futures felt uncertain. She told them words could build doors where none seemed visible. Clara grew taller, her braids neater, but her spirit just as bold. She would often recount the story of how she had solved 2 lonely hearts with one brave question. Daniel's forge thrived, the house filled with warmth and shared silence that never felt empty. Sometimes on quiet evenings, Eliza would sit on the porch and watch the sunset stretch across the prairie. She would think of that first train, how she had believed its departure marked her ending. But trains leave, and sometimes that leaving is mercy. If you have ever waited on a platform longer than you should have, if you have ever worn hope like a dress that no longer fit, know this gently and deeply. Rejection is not the final chapter. It is the clearing of space. The right love does not rush in with noise. It arrives quietly, stays steadily, stands beside you when the world watches. And sometimes it begins with the fearless question of a child who simply refuses to accept that loneliness is permanent. If this story settled into your heart tonight, let it rest there for a moment. Then tell me, from where in this wide and beautiful world are you listening? Like this tale, if it reminded you that second chances are real. Share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more Wild West stories told softly, like memories passed hand to hand beneath an open sky. I will be here by the fire, waiting to tell the next one.